My name is Abigail Morgan, and at 32 years old, I never expected to be completely cut out of my family. When my parents signed everything over to my sister Jessica, I felt like my heart had been ripped from my chest. The family business, our childhood home, every single asset they owned, gone in an instant. They even told people I had moved on from the family. But they never expected what would happen at that final lawyer meeting. Nobody saw it coming, especially not Jessica with her smug smile. If you want to know how I walked in and took it all back, keep watching. Before I get into this devastating story of family betrayal, drop a comment letting me know where you are watching from, and hit that like and subscribe button. This journey changed my entire life, and I think it might change how you see family loyalty too. Growing up in suburban Boston, we were what most people would call the perfect American family. My father Harold built a successful construction supply company from the ground up, and my mother Martha was the quintessential supportive wife who managed our beautiful colonial home. My sister Jessica is 3 years older than me, and from the outside we seemed like normal siblings. But those who knew us well understood there was always an undercurrent of tension. I took after my father in many ways: practical, hardworking, and determined. After college, I became a physical therapist, specializing in helping accident victims rebuild their lives. There was something deeply satisfying about watching my patients progress from devastating injuries to regaining their independence. My patients often told me I had a gift for balancing compassion with the right amount of tough love to get them moving again. Jessica was different. She had our mother's charm and beauty, but there was always something calculating behind her smile. While I worked through college with scholarships and part-time jobs, Jessica dropped out of 3 different universities, each time convincing our parents to pay for expensive apartments and cars that somehow always ended up damaged or abandoned when she lost interest. By the time we reached our 30s, the pattern was well established. Jessica would create financial disasters, and our parents would bail her out. A failed jewelry business that mysteriously lost its inventory. A condo renovation that went thousands over budget when Jessica insisted on luxury upgrades. An investment in her boyfriend Ethan's startup that disappeared overnight when he moved to California without her. What made it all so confusing was that our parents were typically rational people when it came to finances. Dad built his business through careful planning and strategic growth. They saved diligently for retirement and made wise investments. Yet when it came to Jessica, all that financial sense vanished. She just needs a little more time to find her path, Mom would say, whenever I expressed concern about another bailout. Not everyone figures things out as easily as you did, Abigail. That was another pattern. My stability was never celebrated, just expected. When I purchased my first small home near the hospital where I worked, Dad nodded approvingly but said little else. When Jessica rented a luxury apartment, she clearly could not afford they helped with the security deposit and first 6 months of rent. My grandfather Thomas was the only one who seemed to see through the dynamics. Dad's father, he had been the original founder of the family business before passing the reins to my father. Well into his 80s when I was in my 20s, he remained sharp as a tack and often invited me for Sunday afternoon chess games. "You remind me of myself," he told me during one of our matches. "You understand that wealth comes from creating value, not from taking what others have built." While my parents increasingly centered family events around Jessica's chaotic schedule, Grandpa Thomas made time specifically for me. He taught me about business principles, investment strategies, and most importantly, how to read people's true intentions. "Watch what people do, not what they say," he advised me once after Jessica had tearfully promised to pay back money she had borrowed from our parents. Patterns tell you everything you need to know about a person's character. Grandpa Thomas passed away 2 years ago at the age of 89. His death hit me hard, not just because I loved him, but because I lost the one family member who truly saw me. At his funeral, I noticed Jessica seemed more interested in discussing the family business with Dad than mourning our grandfather. Something about her attentiveness to Dad made me uneasy, but I dismissed it as grief, making me paranoid. I had no idea then how prophetic my grandfather's warnings about character would prove to be, or how much Jessica had already been manipulating our family dynamic behind the scenes. The subtle favoritism I had experienced growing up was about to transform into something far more devastating. The first major crack in our family foundation appeared shortly after Grandpa Thomas's funeral. While helping Mom organize his personal effects, I discovered financial records indicating large sums of money had been withdrawn from his personal accounts during the last year of his life. The timing coincided with Jessica's newest venture, an online boutique that had supposedly been funded by her savings. When I gently asked Mom about the withdrawals, she became unusually defensive. "Your grandfather was perfectly capable of deciding what to do with his money, Abigail. I am sure if he gave money to Jessica, he had his reasons." Something did not add up. Grandpa had always emphasized building things on your own, not handouts. When I mentioned my plan to ask Jessica directly about the funds, Mom's reaction shocked me. "I think it would be better if you let this go. Jessica is finally doing well with her business, and bringing up money would just seem like you are jealous of her success." Jealous. The accusation stung, especially since I had always supported Jessica's endeavors despite my private concerns. Still, I could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. A week later, I invited Jessica for coffee, determined to clear the air. The cafe was busy that morning, but I spotted Jessica immediately, her designer purse occupying the chair across from her. When I brought up Grandpa's accounts, her expression shifted from surprise to anger in an instant. "Are you accusing me of something?" she demanded, loud enough that nearby patrons turned to look. "First, you try to monopolize Grandpa while he was alive, and now you are policing what he chose to give me." "That is not what I meant," I tried to explain. "I just wanted to understand the situation better. The situation is that you cannot stand that Grandpa wanted to help me succeed. You have always been jealous because you think you were his favorite." The conversation deteriorated from there. By the time we left, Jessica was tearfully calling Mom on her phone, and I felt like I had stumbled into some alternate reality where asking a simple question made me the villain. The following Sunday dinner at our parents' house, the atmosphere was glacial. Dad barely spoke to me, and Mom hovered around Jessica as if protecting her from me. When I tried to explain my perspective, Dad cut me off. "Your sister says you accused her of manipulating Grandpa for money. That is a serious allegation, Abigail, and frankly, I am disappointed in you." No matter how I tried to clarify what had actually happened, it was clear their minds were made up. Jessica had somehow transformed my question into a vicious attack, and they believed her version completely. That dinner marked the beginning of my gradual exclusion from family life. The following month, I called Mom to confirm Thanksgiving plans, only to learn they had decided to keep things small this year and had already invited Jessica and her new boyfriend. "Maybe we can do something with you the weekend after," Mom suggested, as if missing a family Thanksgiving was a minor inconvenience. I spent that holiday with friends, telling myself it was just a misunderstanding that would soon blow over. But when Christmas brought another last-minute disinvitation, the pattern became impossible to ignore. My boyfriend Brian witnessed my growing isolation firsthand. We had been dating for about a year, and he could not understand how my family dynamic had shifted so dramatically. "Have you tried talking to your dad alone?" he suggested one evening, after I received a terse text from Mom saying a planned family dinner was canceled. "Maybe without your mom and Jessica around, he would be more receptive." Taking Brian's advice, I scheduled a lunch with Dad near his office. For the first 20 minutes, things seemed promising. He asked about my work and seemed genuinely interested in a challenging case I was handling. But when I gently brought up the family tension, his demeanor changed instantly. "Your sister says you have been making passive-aggressive comments about her business," he said. "She feels you do not respect her accomplishments." "Dad, when have I ever done that? You know I have always supported Jessica." He stared at his plate. "Your mother and I think perhaps you are struggling with the fact that Jessica is finally coming into her own. She has really stepped up lately, showing interest in the family business and our future planning." The pieces clicked into place. Jessica had been positioning herself as the dutiful daughter while I was being systematically pushed aside. Each attempt I made to bridge the growing divide only seemed to widen it as Jessica twisted my words and actions into attacks. Over the next year, family gatherings became rare exceptions rather than the rule. When we did meet, conversation remained superficial, with Jessica often steering discussion toward her growing role in Dad's business. I noticed Dad had given her an office at company headquarters, though her actual responsibilities remained vague. Brian watched my repeated attempts at reconciliation with growing concern. "Abby, I do not think this is about anything you did," he said after another difficult family interaction. From everything you have told me, Jessica is deliberately pushing you out and your parents are letting it happen. As painful as it was to admit, I knew he was right. The sister I grew up with was systematically destroying my relationship with our parents, and for what? The question haunted me until an unexpected phone call provided the devastating answer. Eleanor Wright had been my mother's friend for decades and had watched Jessica and me grow up. Though retired and living in Florida now, she kept in touch with many people from our hometown. Her call came on a Tuesday morning as I was preparing for work. "Abigail, honey, I have been thinking about you and wanted to check in," she began, her voice unusually tentative. "Have you spoken with your parents recently about their estate planning?" The question seemed odd. "No, why would I?" There was a long pause. "I probably should not say anything, but it does not sit right with me. Martha mentioned they updated their will recently. She said they have decided to leave everything to Jessica since she has taken such an interest in the family business." My hand tightened around the phone. "Everything? What do you mean by everything?" "The house, the business, their investments. Martha said something about you having your own successful career and not needing the inheritance like Jessica does." Eleanor's voice softened. "Honey, I know it is not my place, but it just does not seem right after how hard your grandfather and father worked to build that business." I thanked Eleanor for her concern, but assured her there must be some misunderstanding. My parents would never cut me out completely. They were practical people who valued fairness. Yet even as I spoke, the words doubt crept in. 2 days later, an email arrived from Gregory Patterson, the family lawyer who had handled Grandpa's estate. The subject line read, "Morgan Family Resolution Meeting." The message was brief and formal, requesting my presence at his office the following Monday at 2 p.m. for matters regarding the Morgan family estate planning. The weekend passed in a blur of anxiety. Brian offered to accompany me, but something told me this needed to be faced alone. When Monday arrived, I took the afternoon off work and drove to the familiar office building downtown where Gregory had practiced for 20 years. The conference room was already occupied when I arrived. Mom and Dad sat on one side of the polished table with Jessica beside them. Gregory sat at the head of the table with a folder open before him. Their conversation stopped abruptly when I entered. "Abigail, thank you for joining us," Gregory said, gesturing to the empty chair across from my family. "We can now begin." What followed was the most painful 30 minutes of my life. In measured legal terms, Gregory explained that Harold and Martha Morgan had updated their will and estate plan. The family business, Morgan Building Supply, would transfer completely to Jessica upon their deaths. The family home and all other assets would likewise go to her, with the exception of a small money bequest to me, equivalent to about 3 months of my current salary. "We feel this arrangement acknowledges Jessica's commitment to continuing the family legacy," Dad explained, not quite meeting my eyes. "The business needs a clear succession plan, and Jessica has shown real aptitude for management." Jessica, whose longest employment had been 6 months at a boutique before she was fired for register discrepancies, nodded solemnly as if she were a seasoned executive. "But what about Grandpa's wishes?" I asked, struggling to keep my voice steady. "He built that company from nothing. He always talked about it, supporting the whole family." "Your grandfather left the company to me, and I have the right to determine its future," Dad replied, an edge entering his voice. "Jessica has been working alongside me for over a year now, learning the business. You chose a different path." "A path you encouraged me to take," I reminded him. "You always said you were proud that I found my own career." Mom reached across the table as if to pat my hand, then seemed to think better of it. "Honey, you have your therapy practice and your little house. You are doing just fine on your own. Jessica needs this security for her future." "And what about my security, my future?" The injustice of it all threatened to choke me. "You have moved on from this family," Jessica said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "You hardly ever visit anymore. You miss holidays. You have your own life now, and we respect that." The audacity of her statement left me speechless. She had systematically worked to exclude me from family events and was now using that very exclusion as justification for disinheriting me. Gregory cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I should note that this arrangement is unusual for families with multiple children, but as your parents are of sound mind and the assets are legally theirs to distribute, everything is in order." The meeting concluded with paperwork being signed. No one asked if I had questions or concerns. No one acknowledged the magnitude of what had just happened. As we filed out of the conference room, Jessica brushed past me with a small, triumphant smile that only I could see. In the parking lot, I made one last attempt to reach my father. "Dad, please help me understand why this is happening. What did I do to deserve being cut out like this?" For a moment, something like doubt flickered in his eyes. Then Mom called his name from their car, and the moment passed. "This is what is best for the family business," he said firmly. "I hope someday you will understand that." I watched them drive away, Jessica in her own luxury car, following behind. Everything my grandfather and father had built over decades, everything that represented our family legacy, had just been promised to the one person who had never built anything of her own. That night alone in my house, I finally allowed myself to break down. Brian came over with takeout food and held me while I cried, my body shaking with the force of betrayal and loss. Not just financial loss, but the loss of the family I thought I had. "They told people I moved on from the family," I whispered between sobs. Jessica made them believe I abandoned them when she was the one pushing me out all along. As the initial shock subsided, a hollowness settled in its place. For 3 months, I went through the motions of my life. I treated my patients, paid my bills, and tried to accept that my family, as I had known it, was gone. Jessica had won, and there seemed to be nothing I could do about it. Until a certified letter arrived that would change everything. The envelope bore the letterhead of Winters and Associates, a law firm I had never heard of. Inside was a formal letter requesting my presence regarding matters of the estate of Thomas Morgan. My grandfather had been dead for 2 years, his estate settled long ago, or so I had thought. The address listed was for an office in a historic building downtown, not far from where Gregory Patterson practiced. Curiosity overrode my hesitation, and I scheduled an appointment for the following week. Winters and Associates occupied the entire top floor of the building, the offices old but impeccably maintained. The receptionist led me to a corner office where an elderly man rose from behind a massive oak desk. "Miss Morgan, thank you for coming. I am Alexander Winters." His handshake was firm despite his age, which I guessed to be at least 70. "I was your grandfather's attorney for over 40 years. I frowned in confusion, but Gregory Patterson handled Grandpa's will and estate. Alexander gestured for me to sit. "Gregory handled certain aspects, yes, but your grandfather had other legal arrangements that were kept separate by his explicit instruction." He retrieved a thick folder from a safe behind his desk. Thomas was a remarkable man, very perceptive about people and their motivations. In the last few years of his life, he became concerned about family dynamics, particularly regarding your sister Jessica. A chill ran through me. "What do you mean?" Thomas observed patterns that troubled him. He came to me approximately 3 years ago to create a separate trust and legal framework independent of his standard will. He was quite specific about keeping these arrangements confidential until the appropriate time. Alexander opened the folder and removed several documents. "Your grandfather documented numerous instances where Jessica attempted to manipulate him financially. Requests for loans that were actually gifts. Attempts to have him change banking arrangements. Even an incident where she tried to have him sign property over to her, claiming it was routine paperwork." My mind flashed back to the withdrawals I had discovered after his death, so she was taking money from him. Not successfully in most cases. Thomas was too shrewd for direct manipulation, but he worried about what might happen after he was gone, particularly regarding your parents. Alexander showed me copies of notes my grandfather had kept detailing conversations and incidents with Jessica. He had been building a case meticulously documenting her behavior. Thomas believed Jessica would eventually try to position herself to inherit everything, potentially at your expense. He was particularly concerned because your father tends to avoid conflict, and your mother has always had a blind spot where Jessica is concerned. I struggled to process what I was hearing. But why am I just learning about this now? Grandpa died 2 years ago. Alexander nodded gravely. The trust your grandfather established had specific timing provisions. He did not want to create family conflict prematurely. The terms specified that these matters would only be revealed if certain conditions arose, such as attempts to disinherit you from family assets. How did you know that had happened? Thomas arranged for certain legal filings to be monitored. When your parents updated their will with Gregory Patterson, it triggered a notification to my office. He leaned forward. What you need to understand, Abigail, is that your parents do not have the legal authority they think they do over the family business and certain other assets. My heart began to race. What are you saying exactly? I am saying that your grandfather created a separate ownership structure for Morgan Building Supply and several other key family assets. While your father believes he has full ownership, the legal reality is more complex. Thomas transferred majority ownership to a trust of which you are the primary beneficiary subject to certain conditions. Alexander slid several diagrams across the desk, showing ownership structures and legal entities I had never known existed. Your grandfather wanted the business to stay in the family, but he was concerned about Jessica's influence. He structured things so that if attempts were made to cut you out, these protections would activate. I stared at the documents in disbelief. Does this mean what I think it means? It means, Miss Morgan, that your parents cannot legally sign over the family business to Jessica because they do not have complete ownership to transfer. And there is more. He produced another document. This is evidence that Jessica has been systematically manipulating company finances since taking her position there. Your grandfather suspected she might attempt this and put monitoring systems in place. For the next hour, Alexander walked me through the intricate legal framework my grandfather had created and the evidence he had accumulated. The picture that emerged was both heartbreaking and vindicating. My grandfather had seen Jessica's true nature and had taken steps to protect both me and the family legacy from her manipulation. So, what happens now? I asked finally. That depends on what you want to do with this information. We could proceed quietly informing your parents privately of the legal reality. Or, Alexander's eyes twinkled slightly, we could attend the final will reading that Gregory Patterson has scheduled for next week. Final will reading. Yes. It seems your parents have decided to formalize their new estate plan with a family meeting. Gregory sent notification to all interested parties, which included my firm due to some remaining connections to your grandfather's estate. For the first time in months, I felt a spark of hope quickly followed by uncertainty. I do not want to hurt my parents. I just want the truth to come out. The truth has a way of doing that on its own, Alexander said, closing the folder. Sometimes it just needs a little help with timing. As I left his office, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Grief that my grandfather had seen the family fracturing and had been unable to prevent it. Anger at Jessica's manipulation. Relief that someone had seen through her schemes. And a growing determination to set things right. That night, I called Brian and told him everything. What should I do? I asked after explaining the situation. He was quiet for a moment. Abby, your grandfather went to extraordinary lengths to protect you and the family business. He must have known this day might come. I think you owe it to him to see his plan through. Deep down, I knew he was right. For too long, I had allowed Jessica's manipulation to go unchallenged. It was time to stand up not just for myself, but for the legacy my grandfather had worked so hard to build and protect. I called Alexander the next morning. I will be at that meeting, I told him, and I want the whole truth to come out. The day of the final will reading arrived with a clarity I had not felt in months. Brian drove me to Gregory Patterson's office, squeezing my hand reassuringly before I got out of the car. Remember, you are not doing anything wrong, he said. You are just bringing the truth to light. Alexander Winters was waiting for me in the lobby, a briefcase in his hand, and a look of calm determination on his face. Are you ready, Miss Morgan? I nodded, and together we took the elevator to Gregory's floor. When we entered the conference room, the scene was nearly identical to the previous meeting. Mom, Dad, and Jessica sat on one side of the table with Gregory at the head. The only difference was Jessica's boyfriend, Ethan, who had returned from California and now sat beside her. Their expressions when they saw Alexander enter behind me ranged from confusion to alarm. Abigail, we were not expecting you to bring counsel, Gregory said, rising from his chair. Alexander Winters, the elderly lawyer, introduced himself. I represent certain interests related to the estate of Thomas Morgan, which I believe are relevant to today's proceedings. Jessica's eyes narrowed. This meeting is about my parents' will, not my grandfather's estate. That was settled years ago. I am afraid that is not entirely accurate, Alexander replied. calmly taking a seat beside me. Please, Mr. Patterson, proceed with your agenda. I will interject when appropriate. Gregory looked uncertainly at my parents, who nodded their permission to continue. He cleared his throat and began reviewing the updated will and estate plan, confirming the arrangements that had been discussed at the previous meeting. The family business home and investments would all transfer to Jessica, with only a token amount going to me. As Gregory finished his summary, Jessica reached for the documents he had prepared for signing. Her fingers had barely touched the paper when Alexander spoke. Before those documents are signed, I believe there are some legal facts that need to be established. His voice was gentle but firm as he opened his briefcase. Mr. and Mrs. Morgan, are you aware of the actual ownership structure of Morgan Building Supply? Dad frowned. Of course I am. I have owned it outright since my father transferred it to me before his death. Alexander placed a document on the table. I am afraid that is not the case. This is the actual ownership transfer executed by Thomas Morgan 7 years ago. While you were given operational control and a significant ownership stake, majority ownership was transferred to the Thomas Morgan Family Trust. Gregory leaned forward to examine the document, his expression shifting from skepticism to concern. I have never seen this paperwork before. That was by design, Alexander explained. Thomas Morgan was concerned about potential manipulation of family assets. He instructed me to keep these arrangements confidential unless certain conditions arose. What conditions? Mom asked her, voice tight. Attempts to disinherit Abigail from family assets would be one such condition. Alexander produced another document. This is Thomas Morgan's true final will and designation of trust beneficiaries. It names Abigail Morgan as the primary beneficiary of the trust that controls Morgan Building Supply. The room fell silent. Jessica's face had gone pale while Mom looked from the documents to me in confusion. That cannot be right, Dad said, but his voice lacked conviction. Dad transferred everything to me. We discussed the succession plan extensively. He discussed operational control with you, Alexander corrected gently. But legally he retained ownership control through the trust. He did this specifically because he was concerned about Jessica's influence. Jessica shot to her feet. This is ridiculous. Grandfather would never do something like that. He loved me. He did love you, I said quietly. But he also saw through you. Alexander continued methodically presenting evidence my grandfather had accumulated over years. Financial records showing Jessica's attempts to appropriate funds, documentation of manipulation tactics she had used on our parents. Most damning of all, recent financial records showing how she had begun liquidating company assets since taking her position at the firm. You have been selling off company equipment and property, Alexander said, pointing to a spreadsheet, transferring funds to personal accounts in preparation for taking control. Thomas Morgan anticipated you might attempt this and put monitoring systems in place. Gregory was reviewing the documents with growing alarm. These appear to be legitimate. If they are accurate, then the current will as drafted would be largely ineffectual. The assets it attempts to transfer are not fully under Harold and Martha's control. Jessica turned to our parents, her eyes filling with calculated tears. Mom, Dad, you cannot believe this. This is just Abigail trying to steal what should be mine. She has always been jealous of me. But for once, her performance fell flat. Dad was staring at the financial records, his expression hardening as he recognized equipment and properties that had mysteriously been upgraded or consolidated under Jessica's supervision. You sold the riverfront warehouse, he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Without consulting me, that property has been in our family for 40 years. I was streamlining operations, Jessica insisted, the way you taught me to. By transferring the proceeds to a personal account, Dad pointed to the transaction records. That is not streamlining. That is theft. The facade was crumbling. As more evidence came to light, Jessica's manipulation became impossible to deny. She had been systematically positioning herself to take control of everything while pushing me out of the family. Mom sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down her face. All those things you said about Abigail, about her abandoning the family, you made us believe she did not care anymore. Because you were always so ready to believe the worst of her, Jessica snapped her mask, finally slipping. It was so easy to turn you against her. A few tears, a few twisted stories, and you chose me every time. You always have. The naked truth of her statement hung in the air. My parents exchanged a look of dawning horror as they realized how completely they had been manipulated. Gregory cleared his throat uncomfortably. Given these revelations, I strongly advise against proceeding with the current estate plan. The legal standing of many of these assets is now in question, and there are potential legal issues regarding the financial misconduct documented here. Jessica turned to her boyfriend Ethan, who had remained silent throughout the meeting. Say something. Tell them this cannot be legal. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding her eyes. I think I should step outside. He rose and left without looking back, apparently unwilling to be associated with what was unfolding. Alexander turned to me. As the designated beneficiary of the Thomas Morgan Family Trust, you now have several options for how to proceed. You have legal standing to take control of the trust assets immediately given the documented attempts to disinherit you and the evidence of financial misconduct. All eyes turned to me. After months of pain and exclusion, after being told I had moved on from my family, I now held the power to take everything back. The irony was almost too perfect. I do not want to hurt anyone, I said, looking directly at my parents. I just want the truth acknowledged and the family business protected the way Grandpa intended. Dad nodded slowly, the fight gone from him. Your grandfather was always a better judge of character than I was. I should have listened to him more carefully when he tried to warn me about. He glanced at Jessica, unable to finish the sentence. I suggest we adjourn this meeting and reconvene once everyone has had time to process this information, Gregory said, gathering the unsigned documents. There are significant legal matters to address regarding company assets and potential misappropriation of funds. As we prepared to leave, Jessica made one last desperate attempt. This is not over, she hissed at me. I will fight this in court. I will make sure everyone knows how you manipulated grandfather into cutting me out. Alexander merely smiled. Miss Morgan, I documented every meeting with Thomas over our 40-year relationship. I would be happy to testify about who was doing the manipulating. I suggest you consult with a criminal defense attorney before making any further statements or threats. That was the moment when Jessica finally realized she had lost. Not just the inheritance, but the facade she had maintained for so long. As she stormed out of the conference room, I felt no satisfaction, only a deep sadness for what our family had become. My parents approached me hesitantly in the hallway. Abigail, we do not know what to say, Mom began, her voice breaking. We got it so wrong, Dad added. I cannot believe how blind we were. I looked at these two people who had raised me, who had loved me in their imperfect way, and who had been so thoroughly deceived. We have a lot to talk about, I said. But not today. Today I need some space. As I walked out of that office building with Alexander beside me, I felt like I was emerging from a long darkness. I had walked in and taken back what was rightfully mine, not just material possessions, but my place in the family legacy and my grandfather's faith in me. Brian was waiting in the parking lot, his face anxious until he saw my expression. It worked, he asked as I approached. It worked, I confirmed. Grandpa thought of everything. As we drove away, I looked back at the building where my family remained, trying to make sense of what had happened. I had no idea what came next, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like my grandfather was watching over me, nodding in approval. The days following the revelation were a whirlwind of legal meetings and difficult conversations. Gregory Patterson, clearly embarrassed by his role in the affair, worked cooperatively with Alexander to sort through the legal complexities. As the truth of my grandfather's arrangements became clear, so did the extent of Jessica's deception. She has been systematically laying groundwork for this for years, Alexander explained during one of our meetings. Based on company records, she began redirecting smaller assets shortly after taking her position testing to see if anyone would notice. No one had noticed. Dad had been so pleased to have Jessica showing interest in the business that he had given her unusual freedom with limited oversight. She had used that freedom to begin dismantling the company from within, preparing to sell off its most valuable assets once she gained full control. An audit revealed she had already transferred nearly $500,000 to personal accounts through various schemes. Equipment was sold and the proceeds diverted. Service contracts were created with fake vendors who funneled money back to her. The sophistication of the fraud was stunning. The confrontation with Jessica happened 3 days after the will reading. She arrived unannounced at the company headquarters where I was meeting with Dad and the financial team to assess the damage. "You think you have won, but you have destroyed this family," she announced, bursting into the conference room. "Mom is absolutely devastated." Dad stood up. "Jessica, now is not the time. We are trying to figure out how much damage has been done to the company." Damage I was making improvements. Streamlining an outdated business model. "By stealing from your own family?" I asked quietly. "By selling off assets Grandpa and Dad spent decades building. I was going to reinvest that money. I had plans for modernization that Dad was too old-fashioned to consider." The financial director, Vincent Coleman, who had worked for the company for 15 years, cleared his throat. "Miss Morgan, the records show the funds were transferred to personal accounts, not business development accounts. And there is no documentation of any modernization plan in the company files." Jessica's face flushed with anger. "Of course I kept it separate. Dad would have shot down my ideas without even considering them. I was going to present everything once I had control." "After you had cut me out completely," I added. "After you had convinced Mom and Dad I had abandoned the family." "You did abandon us. You were never there." "Because you made sure I was not invited," I said, maintaining my calm. "You systematically pushed me out so you could take everything." For a brief moment, something like shame flickered across Jessica's face, quickly replaced by defiance. "You have no idea what it was like growing up in your shadow. Perfect Abigail with her perfect grades and her perfect career. Grandpa's favorite, Dad's pride and joy." Dad looked genuinely bewildered. "Jessica, that was never true. We were always so proud of both of you." "You were proud of her accomplishments. You were just relieved when I did not screw up again." She turned to me, eyes blazing. "You think you deserve all this because you followed the rules. I was the one who stayed close to the family. I was the one who showed interest in the business." "Only when you realized there was money to be gained," I replied. "Grandpa saw through it. That is why he protected the company the way he did." The confrontation ended with security escorting Jessica from the building. As she left, she shouted threats about lawsuits and exposing family secrets, but Alexander had assured us her legal position was weak given the evidence of financial misconduct. My relationship with my parents entered a fragile reconstruction phase. Mom called daily, her voice tentative, as she tried to rebuild our connection. Dad threw himself into damage control at the company, working alongside me to identify and correct the issues Jessica had created. "I should have seen it," he said repeatedly. "All the signs were there, but I did not want to believe my own daughter could do something like this." The hardest moment came when they invited me to their house for dinner, the first such invitation in over a year. The home I had grown up in felt both familiar and strange as I sat at the dining room table where hundreds of family meals had taken place. "We owe you an apology," Mom said, her hands fidgeting with her napkin. "We let ourselves be manipulated into pushing you away." "We believed what we wanted to believe," Dad added. "Jessica told us what we wanted to hear, and we never questioned it." I looked at these two people who had raised me, feeling the complex tangle of love and hurt that defined our relationship now. "I need to know something. If Grandpa had not set up those legal protections, would you really have left me with almost nothing, after everything I have done to make you proud?" They exchanged pained glances. "We thought we were doing what was best for everyone," Mom said weakly. "Jessica convinced us you had your own life and did not need the inheritance." "She said you looked down on the family business," Dad continued, "that you saw it as beneath your professional status." I shook my head in disbelief. "I have never thought that. Never. I chose physical therapy because I love helping people recover, not because I was too good for the family business." "We know that now," Mom whispered. "We were blind, and we hurt you terribly. Can you ever forgive us?" Forgiveness, I was discovering, was not a single moment but a process. "I am trying," I told them honestly, "but it will take time to rebuild trust." Meanwhile, the legal consequences for Jessica were beginning to materialize. Alexander filed legal actions to recover the misappropriated funds, and Gregory advised my parents that criminal charges were a possibility, given the scale of the financial misconduct. "Would you really press charges against your own sister?" Brian asked one evening as we discussed the situation. I sighed, the weight of the decision heavy on my shoulders. "I do not want to, but the company lost a lot of money. Employees could have lost their jobs if this had continued. It is not just about me or my family anymore. In the end, Jessica avoided criminal charges by agreeing to full financial restitution and signing a legal agreement relinquishing any claims to family assets. The last I heard, she had moved to Arizona with a new boyfriend, severing contact with all of us. As for me, I found myself in an unexpected position. According to my grandfather's trust provisions, I now controlled majority ownership of Morgan Building Supply, a company I had never worked for or studied. Dad maintained operational control as president, but major decisions required my approval. "What are you going to do?" Brian asked after a particularly long day of meetings with the company board. "Are you going to leave your therapy practice?" It was a question I had been wrestling with for weeks. "I love my work with patients," I told him, "but I also feel a responsibility to Grandpa's legacy. He trusted me to protect what he built." The solution came gradually. I reduced my clinical hours to part-time and began taking business classes at night. Dad created a new role for me at the company, allowing me to learn the business from the ground up without disrupting the existing management structure. Sarah Johnson, a longtime employee who had always been loyal to my grandfather, became an unexpected ally and mentor. "Your grandfather used to talk about you all the time," she told me during my first week. "He always said you had his business sense, even if you did not know it yet." Slowly, I began to see what Grandpa had recognized in me. The same skills that made me a good therapist, the ability to listen and solve problems, methodically translated surprisingly well to business operations. My outsider perspective allowed me to question inefficient processes that had become entrenched over time. 6 months after the confrontation at the lawyer's office, Morgan Building Supply was not just recovering from Jessica's schemes, but beginning to thrive under the new collaborative leadership structure Dad and I had established. The company that had nearly been stripped apart was now growing stronger than ever. 1 year after I walked into that lawyer's office and reclaimed my inheritance, I stood in the newly renovated headquarters of Morgan Building Supply. The building had been transformed with modern offices, but the same solid foundation my grandfather had established decades ago. Much like our family, it had been damaged but not destroyed, and the rebuilding process had made it stronger. The journey to family healing had been complicated and remains ongoing. My relationship with my parents has improved significantly, though there are still moments when old hurts resurface. Mom makes a consistent effort to be present in my life now, calling regularly and taking genuine interest in both my therapy work and my growing role in the family business. Dad and I have developed a new kind of partnership. He teaches me the industry knowledge acquired over decades, while I bring fresh perspectives that help the company adapt to changing markets. We have our disagreements, but they are handled with a new respect that was missing before. "Your grandfather would be proud," Dad told me recently as we celebrated landing a major contract. "Not just of the business success, but of how you handled everything with such integrity." Jessica remains absent from our lives. Occasionally, Mom mentions having received a text or call from her, but there has been no meaningful reconciliation. The trust she broke seems beyond repair, at least for now. I have made peace with that absence, understanding that some relationships cannot be forced back together once broken. The company itself has flourished under our joint leadership. We established the Thomas Morgan Foundation in Grandpa's honor, providing scholarships for young people interested in skilled trades and construction. It feels like the perfect tribute to a man who built so much with his hands and his heart. Brian has been my rock throughout this journey. 6 months ago, he proposed during a weekend trip to the lakeside cabin my grandfather used to love. We are planning a small wedding next spring with a focus on creating new family traditions rather than dwelling on past hurts. My work as a physical therapist continues part-time. I could not bear to abandon the patients who have come to rely on me, and truthfully, the work keeps me grounded. On days when business concerns become overwhelming, helping someone take their first steps after an injury reminds me of what truly matters. The most profound change has been internal. I now understand that standing up for yourself is not selfish but necessary. For too long, I accepted being pushed aside, believing that keeping peace was more important than demanding fairness. My grandfather saw this tendency in me and created safeguards to protect me until I learned to protect myself. "Always remember that true family supports your growth, not your diminishment," he wrote in a letter Alexander gave me after everything was settled. Never let anyone convince you that you deserve less than your full place in this world. Those words have become my guiding principle, not just in family matters, but in all aspects of life. I have learned that healthy relationships are built on mutual respect, not sacrifice of self. That lesson alone was worth more than any material inheritance. The legal structures my grandfather put in place have been reorganized into a family trust that protects the business while benefiting all legitimate family interests. I made sure the new arrangement includes provisions for any future children Brian and I might have, as well as education funds for the children of long-term employees. The company that was nearly stolen now supports dozens of families in our community. As I reflect on this journey from betrayal to restoration, I am struck by how differently things could have ended without my grandfather's foresight. His ability to see people clearly, to recognize patterns of behavior and prepare accordingly saved not just my inheritance, but possibly the entire family legacy. So, what lessons can we take from this experience? First, trust your instincts when something feels wrong in your family dynamics. Second, document everything when dealing with potentially manipulative people. Third, and perhaps most importantly, understand that standing up for yourself is not just your right, but sometimes your responsibility to those who have invested in your future. I walked into that lawyer's office and took back what was rightfully mine, but the true victory was not in the material assets recovered. It was in reclaiming my place in the family story and honoring the legacy of a grandfather who believed in me even when I struggled to believe in myself. Have you ever experienced a family betrayal that forced you to stand up for yourself? How did you handle it? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need to hear that standing up for yourself is not just okay, it is sometimes absolutely necessary. Thank you for listening to my journey, and remember that sometimes the most painful chapters lead to the most beautiful transformations.